Thomas Jefferson said that he was the greatest man in the world. His good friend, the greatest man in the world. And in today's political climate, it's very unlikely that he would get elected to high office. It is quite remarkable with all of the different events that I've been able to attend and rallies and events to see all of the political marketing we have today of candidates. We have all these political consultants that are hired. Our candidates almost have to be celebrities. Dress and images handled. They're coached on speech delivery and gesturing. And here we live in a 24-hour news cycle, and everything is in sound bites. The climate's much different today. And I really think that it would be highly unlikely that this individual would get elected to high office, because we really wouldn't take probably a second look at him. He didn't usually make a good first impression, given his looks, given his personality in many people's minds. He's brown-haired, blue-eyed. He's only 5'4". Really, at a time when the average height in colonial America was 5'8", and certainly standing next to George Washington, who was 6'2", there would be a huge contrast there. But here's a man, he's short, he's slim. Some estimates are that he didn't weigh any more than 100 to 140 pounds. And if he walked in a room, we probably wouldn't be overly impressed with his looks. If introduced to him, you're not overly impressed either. He lacks a lot of physical charisma. He's painfully shy. He speaks with a soft voice, a low voice. At first, you're not really impressed. If you spend a couple minutes talking to him for any prolonged period of time, your opinion starts to change. You realize, here's a very smart guy. He's a very educated guy. He's widely read. And really, for much of his life, he was a constant reader. He's a student of history, which I love. He had studied history and knew a lot about history. If given an opportunity to talk with anybody that knew him well, to get a character reference, to find out really what he's like, you soon discover that he is a man of strong principles, and he lives by strong principles and convictions. You realize that he's very deliberative by nature. I've met people like that before. Sometimes people like that be accused of being indecisive, but no, he's very deliberative by nature. He takes his time for making the big decisions. He's a savvy politician, and he knows how to foster compromise. He may be a quiet individual and not that outgoing, but he knows how to interact with people. He knows how to build consensus, and he is remembered for that. He's also a very humble man. Pastor Whitmer talked about meeting some politicians and here in the state of Delaware, and sometimes the arrogance that emits from some of our politicians today. But he was a very humble man, and quite oftentimes was willing to defer credit to other people when he had played a big part of it, but he was willing to hand that credit off to someone else. The person that I'm talking about this morning, that we'll be talking about this morning and in the next session, the candidate, the person that we're going to talk about, is James Madison. And I'm going to tell you in the second session about some of the events and circumstances that left a huge, indelible impression on James Madison that I think God used in a great way. I'm also going to tell you in the second session about some of the biggest influences on Madison, some of the people who made an impact on Madison, some of them educators, some of them, in fact, ministers of the gospel that left, I think, a big impact on Madison. I'm also going to tell you what I believe to be God's providence in a very historic state election. Despite political obstruction, despite obstacles that were placed in his way, despite some of the political manipulation that occurred, I think God had his hand in a very, very historic election there in Virginia in 1798. And I'm going to tell you about a little church tucked away in the county of Culpeper County, Virginia, that I think helped play a role in that very historic election. And that our title this morning is going to be The Candidate, the Church, and the Election that Helped Save a Nation. And with that, with whetting your appetite a little bit there, I'm going to make that the place that I stop. And when we come back in our second session this morning, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this candidate, James Madison. I'm going to show you through his life the things that molded and made him, and how God, I think, used him in a way. God can use anyone, but God used him, I think, in a very providential way to lead him to Philadelphia, and we'll talk about his impact here. But he first had to win an election, and that election, I'll talk about how things unfolded, and some very exciting things that I want to share with you at this time. So Pastor Whitmer, if you'll come, and we'll dismiss. Well, I told you that the title, this morning I shared with you, just before we broke, that the title is The Candidate, the Church, and the Election that Helped Save the Nation. And the candidate that we spent some time just sort of setting the scene is James Madison. And we'll get to that later, and we'll get to that election, and we'll talk about the church, I think, that played a part. But I want to start off by just sort of letting you see a little bit about Madison. I have to show you how God used this individual, and he allowed himself to be used, a man that had a bent towards politics and history, and actually, you'll see, actually gave some consideration of going into the ministry, and how God shaped and used circumstances to mold Madison, and then how God, I think, used him later in history. But I really have to set and start off by pointing out two, I think, very core foundational values that Madison has and beliefs that he developed through the years. Number one, strong government was essential. Now, not big government like what we know today, not big government, but a stronger government. And government was needed. And certainly Madison preferred a Republican-style government. He believed that man had a sinful nature, which we would all agree with. There's a very famous quote of his from one of the Federalist Papers there. He said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. We need government. But Madison also believed there needed to be checks and balances. And so as he studied history and he saw governments from the past and history, he studied countries from the past, he saw that good government was a strong government, a central government, but there would be checks and balances in that. So I'll show you how he comes to develop that very strong opinion. The second thing that's also true is that he believed that religious liberty was foundational to every right that really I think every American, he believes, should be afforded. Your pastor stood up here earlier and said, the great privileges that we have of gathering here and him standing behind this pulpit is thanks to men like James Madison and others from our past that saw that it was essential to put it on paper and say, this ought to be a guaranteed right that every American has. And I'll come to show you how he came to that very strong conviction. And I think it was certainly through God molding and working in his life. Madison was born in 1751. He was the oldest of 12 kids. 12. 5 of his siblings never even lived into adulthood. But imagine, seeing some of them die as he's a young boy there. But he's born into privilege. And Madison grew up on a 5,000-acre plantation there in the Virginia Piedmont region with the Blue Ridge Mountains in sight in Orange County, Virginia. And it's this Montpelier, where he grew up, his mother had actually inherited from her father, who was a wealthy plantation owner. And there were about 118 slaves that worked at Montpelier there. But he grew up in privilege, and so having grown up in privilege, he was afforded the opportunity of being given an education. And he had 2 tutors that were hired as a young man, and one of them was an Episcopal minister for about 3 years, Thomas Martin. And Madison said that about Thomas Martin, that all that he had become in life, he really owed largely to that man. And that's sort of one thing that you're going to see as a recurring theme here, is that some of the people that made a big impact on Madison's life were, in fact, ministers and teachers. And Madison was raised in the Episcopal Church, and we'll kind of touch a couple times along the way here about that upbringing there, the Anglican Church there in Virginia here. But I want to point out what, as I've read and studied here, I think was made a huge impact on Madison's life as a young man. You know, right there, growing up in Anglican Virginia, which later becomes the Episcopal Church after the American Revolution, Madison saw a lot of persecution of Baptists. He saw a lot of persecution of people that dissented against the Anglican Church. They didn't want their tax dollars going to the Anglican Church and paying for ministers. They strongly disagreed with that. They didn't like the fact that they had to go and get permission to get licenses to preach. You know, and during that time, I think Madison, sort of like the Old Testament example of Moses, who grew up in Egypt and saw the persecution of the Jews, and his heart was sympathetic towards what was going on. I think Madison, you know, from age roughly 10 all the way up into his late 20s here, he saw this religious persecution. He saw some of these Baptist preachers being arrested. He saw during this 18-year period here, we know that there were about 153 cases of persecution. And some of these pastors horsewhipped. Some of these pastors were beaten by mobs of people. Some of these pastors were placed in the stocks, like the one you see here that one pastor, Baptist minister James Ireland, was placed in. And then sometimes they were thrown in jail for very prolonged periods of time, 5, 6 months and longer, for being persecuted. But some 55 Baptist preachers were arrested and thrown in jail during this time. In fact, 14 of them were in Madison's home county of Orange County, Virginia there. So I have to believe that Madison was certainly aware of this and saw this with his own eyes. And in fact, as a young man later, when he becomes a lawyer, he defends some of these guys and he helps get some of these guys out. And God is placing inside his heart a sympathy and an understanding of seeing how important religious freedom was. And, you know, I got to, you know, I wanted to find out what was it a lot of these Baptist preachers were arrested for. Well, you go back and you take a look at some of the offenses. The primary offense was they didn't have a license, and the state issued a license. And then sometimes they would trump up a charge of disturbing the peace. But if you were a dissenting minister, you were non-Anglican, you were Baptist, any other Protestant denomination, you had to go get a license from the church, from the general court there. And you had to ask permission for a license. So you said, well, you know, what's the big deal about getting a license? Get a license and then go preach. Well, it wasn't that easy. The Anglican Church, or the bureaucracy of the Anglican Church, you had to go, and you had to go before that general court, which only met twice a year. So you had to be there on the day that it met. And then you had to show up with a petition with 20 people having signed this petition to ask you to be given permission to get a license and be able to start a church. And then once you submitted the petition, the court had to go and make sure that all 20 of those people were actual residents and they weren't trumped up names. So you had more bureaucracy. And then you had to take an exam, and an Anglican minister gave you an exam. And you had to pass that exam, and you had to get their approval. And if perchance they approved, then the general court would allow a group of, usually 3 ministers to be the final say-so on whether or not that Baptist minister could get a license. And then if you were given a license, you only had that license, that only gave you a right to preach in a place. It didn't give you the right and privilege to go anywhere in the state and preach. If you preached in someone's home, you could get arrested. If you preached outside that jurisdiction, and usually they allowed just Anglican churches in certain districts, if you preached anywhere outside your district, you were arrested. And there were so many Baptists that said, listen, first of all, we're not getting a license. We have a higher authority. It's God that gives us the permission to open up His Word. And I got to think that many of them, like Peter and John from Acts chapter 4, said, listen, you're asking us to stop preaching? We can't stop preaching. We cannot but speak the things which we've seen and heard, and we're going to have to keep preaching. And they went and preached, and so many of these ministers ended up in jails, like the one you see pictured here in Virginia there. And they oftentimes spent very prolonged time in jail. Now imagine, I got to guess that it hasn't been here recently where you've had to visit Pastor Whitmer in jail. And certainly hope not. But these are battles these people had to face back at the time. And you imagine some of these guys, the one classic example, and there's so many examples I could share with you, is a guy named John Weatherford, a preacher. Didn't take a license, refused to take a license, thrown in jail for 5 months there in Virginia. In fact, he'd go over to the window there, and he'd hold the bars, and he would preach, and people would come and listen outside the jail. Imagine that. And they said that there were some people, protesters and people that opposed Weatherford. They came and had knives, and they slashed up his hands. And I read last week, there was a gentleman, read the account of a gentleman that was able to attend Weatherford's funeral years later, and walked up and looked at Pastor Weatherford right there in the casket, and folded there in the casket were his hands, and still visible were those scars where he had been lashed and cut up as a young preacher. And he said it left a lasting impression on him. People would come and gather outside, and so some of the opponents didn't like what Weatherford was preaching. They decided to erect a 10-foot wall outside the jail so that it would keep his congregation, members of his congregation, away. So they spent time and money, someone did, to put it right outside the jail cell there, and to keep his supporters away. And so they rigged up a little system where someone would run a pole over that 10-foot wall with a little white handkerchief and wave it back and forth, and Weatherford knew then he had a congregation. And he went to the window and still preached and let it loose. And these are the battles these guys are facing. This has allowed your pastor the opportunity, and other preachers around the country here today, to not have to go get a license and not have to go spend time in jail for issues like this. So thank the Lord for these men that went before us here. When Madison was 19 years of age, he decided not to go to William and Mary, which was an Anglican university there, but decided to go north, and he went to the College of New Jersey, and went to the College of New Jersey, which is now called Princeton University. It was a school founded by Presbyterians, 7 Presbyterian ministers, birthed out of the Great Awakening. And Madison shows up here, and he has an interest in history and government. He's a very serious student, a very diligent student. He studied so much, spent so much time studying late into the night, that they said that he averaged about 5 hours of sleep a night. And he crammed a 3-year program into 2 years because he was such a serious student. And he finished 1 year early. And then even at that, he went back 1 year voluntarily so he could study theology under the college president, John Witherspoon. And this is a picture here of John Witherspoon's statue there on the campus of Princeton. In fact, I read the caption underneath this picture when I found this image, and some college students said, there's a road there on the campus there. It's either called Witherspoon Way or Road or whatever. And she said, I come to find out that he actually existed. There really was a John Witherspoon. She just thought that they decided to name the road Witherspoon Way or whatever it's named here. But there was a college president, a very influential college president, John Witherspoon. Was born in Scotland and actually was a minister over there for 20 years before he's recruited to come over here to the United States. And men like Benjamin Rush urged him to come and become the college president, turn the college around, put it on financial footing, and he really helped shape the climate there. But I want to say this. Madison was greatly influenced by John Witherspoon in a big way. He certainly learned from Witherspoon about the depravity of human nature, about the depravity of man's sinful nature. He certainly learned the need for divided government from Witherspoon. These are all concepts and principles that Madison files away with his life's experiences and what he comes to really become part of his core belief here. He believes that government should have checks and balances. And, Witherspoon was very slow to embrace the war that we had with Great Britain when the American Revolution broke out, wanting reconciliation. But boy, when they passed the Quebec Act extended French law into the Ohio Valley region, and there was no trial by jury, and they made Roman Catholicism the sole religion, established religion of that area. Then you had Witherspoon. He was ready to take up arms because of religious liberty being threatened. And he really stressed to his students to guard their civil liberties because he said their religious liberties would be in jeopardy next. Let me show you a little quote of Witherspoon. He said, there's not a single instance in history which civil liberty was lost and religious liberty was preserved entire. Now take that thought in. Understand, it's okay when you find, and we hear in the news, that some of our constitutional amendments and some of our rights that have been extended to us through the Bill of Rights are being slowly eroded away. It's okay to be upset over that. It's okay to be concerned. It's okay to call our congressman and say, listen, you need to watch the Second Amendment here, this issue, or you name it. Because once they go, Witherspoon believed the next thing to go would be religious freedom and religious liberty. And so I wholeheartedly agree with that. Being a teacher, there's another thing that I can appreciate in a great way. Witherspoon never led an army into battle. He never ran for high political office, though he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. But he helped educate a whole generation of leaders for the new nation, more than any other man. Aaron Burr, Charles Lee from Virginia, James Madison. And you take a look at the impact that he had on some men that later went on and served in the cabinet, and some men that served in the Continental Congress, and 12 guys that later become governors. His impact, there's no, you could just spend an awful lot of time talking about the impact that this guy made. And let me stay for just a second here. Let me ask you something about your impact. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, Timothy, we're reminded it was certainly impacted by his grandmother. He's impacted by his mother. We know he was impacted by the Apostle Paul, who kind of took him under his wings. And you know also from 1 Timothy chapter 4 that Timothy is reminded to be an example of word, in manner of life, in charity, in spirit, in faith, and purity. Let me ask you about that. What kind of example are you being? Or what about with what you say and how you say it? What about your manner of life, your testimony? What are people observing? What about being an example of love for God and for others? What's your spirit like? Are you positive? Are you pessimistic? Are you negative constantly? What about your faith? Is it weak? Is it strong? What about your purity, desiring to remain unspotted by the world, or are you engaging in worldly things? Witherspoon made a huge impact, and I think there's a lesson to stop and look at here. And let me ask you directly, what's your impact? You're having an impact on someone. You've had an impact on someone. You're continuing to be an impact on someone. What about your colleagues at work? What about those of you that are parents, teaching your children? What kind of example are you being? Now, I think I could get away with saying this, but I'm not back home. But my wife will tell you, and anyone that's a teacher, when we're having issues with student behaviors, you've heard the saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it? And so many young people have picked up attitudes and from the examples of their parents. And so I'm asking you, what kind of example are you being right now? Are you taking God's word and teaching your sons and daughters, yourself, and not simply relying upon your youth pastor, not simply relying upon what they hear from this pulpit? Are you opening up God's word at home with your family? Are you being faithful? Are you faithful to this ministry and this church? What about you grandparents? I know we've got a lot of grandparents in here. What kind of an impact are you having on your grandkids? I was encouraged 2 weeks ago. We had VBS at our church, and I urged some of our grandparents, said, if you have any possible way of bringing your grandchildren, what better way to be a grandparent and have your kids here at VBS and to take in God's word? And, we were at a funeral here of a godly woman that passed away here about a year ago, and I remember sitting at the funeral there and some of her grandkids standing up and saying, every time we come in and we talk about this or that, she said, well, let me go get my Bible. Let me go get my Bible. Let's see what the Bible says. And maybe at the time he didn't want to hear that, but she had made a profound impact on his life and something he never forgot. What about you Sunday school teachers? What about everyone that's involved in ministry here? Are you thinking about your impact, the impact you're making? You've heard of Edward Kimball, some of you, maybe in sermon illustrations. Had a Sunday school teacher of Dwight L. Moody, had an impact on Moody. And Moody had an impact on J. Wilbur Chapman, a famous preacher that got saved later, who then had an impact and helped lead Billy Sunday, the great evangelist. Stop and think about the lasting impact that you're having. So having said all of that, we kind of see these things that are molding James Madison. We're looking at his education here, but let's talk now about some of his political endeavors here. I got to thinking here, at the time of the American Revolution here in 1776, Madison decides to serve in the Virginia State Assembly. How many 20-somethings do we know that are even, first of all, know what's going on in the world and want to get involved in politics or local politics and run for public office, and yet Madison had this desire as a young 25-year-old. I've had the privilege, there's a young man that I had the privilege of only having a couple years in my class in junior high that got elected to the House of Delegates in West Virginia. And I got to see him here this past legislative session. And it warms my heart to see that because he has such an interest in serving and public service here. But Madison is here. He helps draft the state's constitution. And something very important here is during this time period, he helped Jefferson draft something that we refer to as the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. Along with Madison. And listen, this takes 7 years to pass. This doesn't happen just overnight, but Madison with Jefferson wanted to see the Anglican Church disestablished. No more tax money going to the church, and let everyone have complete religious freedom, and something that he fought for. And then, in 1784, after the Revolutionary War was over, the Virginia Assembly kind of went the other direction. The governor at the time was Patrick Henry, and we'll talk a little bit about Patrick Henry here later. Famous Patrick Henry who said, give me liberty or give me death. But they swang the other direction. They said, how about we just take some tax money and give it to all religious denominations? I know you were concerned about the Anglican Church, Lord, but how about now let's just give money to all churches for public morality? And Madison, said, maybe that's still not a great idea to be giving tax dollars out, be in the business of collecting tax money and giving to all churches. How about maybe we have the government stay out of it and we just preach and have religious freedom and we don't have strings attached there? We see Madison sort of at this time seeing how important religious freedom is. But Madison is maturing, and he's learning how to build consensus. And for those 10 years after the American Revolution, things were very, very troublesome. We were in debt, in major debt for a period of time here under the Articles of Confederation. The central government was really powerless. And then in 1787, we get all the states, nearly all of the states together, 12 states together, and we go to Philadelphia, and they want to make some changes with the government. And Madison is 36 years of age, and he's given the privilege of going and representing Virginia here. And for 4 long months during that hot summer there, for 5 hours a day, 6 days a week, 116 days to debate this document and to write it and then to vote on it. And it's something we hold so precious today. You know, when Madison got there, he wanted to see everything up close. He took a seat right up front. He didn't even sit with his delegation, and he took very detailed notes. Now, they had a secretary that was keeping track of the minutes. Madison was worried he was going to forget something or not get all the details. So he asked for permission to sit right up front there, and his own shorthand scribbled notes and abbreviations. And then he took the time each evening to go back and pour through his rough notes, and he kept a really detailed record of what went on. And we wouldn't know anything at all that went on at Philadelphia, and the debate and the argument and the compromise that went on had Madison not kept a detailed record for us in history. And never wanted it published during his lifetime. When he passed away later, Dolly Madison sold his notes in 1837 to the United States government for about $30,000 so that we could have a written record, and the U.S. Archives purchased that. I figured here that probably going back looking at $2,002, that would be about $600,000, over $500,000 to purchase that, and she did that. But I want to show you something here that Madison said about this convention. We oftentimes refer to what went on there at Philadelphia as a miracle in Philadelphia. And it really was quite remarkably a miracle. Madison believed that God had providentially been involved in the writing of that document and everything that went on. And he said, just like back during the American Revolution, he said, it's impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive the finger of that almighty hand. And if you go on to see the rest of that, you see that he says, you know, it happened during the American Revolution. It's happened here. What went on here was a miracle. And certainly he gives God the credit. You know, we call Madison the father of the Constitution. And he oftentimes deferred and said, listen, there were so many other great minds, so many other guys that were here that had a part in writing this document, putting this document together. But you can see from this quote here, he believes God deserves the credit. And God was providentially involved. And so right after that, that's when the real battle began for 3 years. It took 3 years for each of the states to take a look at that Constitution and to vote on it. And you had two sides. You had Federalists. You had Madison on one hand, who liked the document, thought it created a strong central government. And you had people on the other hand that were kind of reluctant. We called them anti-Federalists, worried about the size of government. Some of them wanted another constitutional convention, and Madison said, oh no, we can't go back there. This took too long for us to craft this, for us to throw it all away and to go back and do this over again. And some of those anti-Federalists, and I would agree with them, said, hey, we ought to be given a Bill of Rights. Let's just not trust that the government will give us a right to a trial by jury, and trust that they'll give us free speech, and trust that they'll give us freedom to worship. We want to see it on paper. You give it to us on paper. And just like we don't trust sometimes what politicians tell us or promise us, we want something in writing. And these guys wanted it in writing. So Madison started thinking some of that over there. But Madison's just reluctant, and he, along with John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, wrote a bunch of essays anonymously and stuck them in the New York newspapers and urged people to sign off and vote in favor of this document. And a lot of states said, listen, we'll accept it on the condition that when you go back, that you add some Bill of Rights, so you add some things that are on paper to guarantee every American. So that's our candidate. That's kind of leading everything up to talking about how Madison through all these years has been brought forward here. So now I want to tell you about the church. Now, which is part of our title here, the candidate, the church, and the election that helps save a nation. When I'm talking about the church, I am talking about the body of believers, about Protestants in general, Protestant believers who wanted to specifically spell out some guaranteed rights, some Bill of Rights here, but I'm also going to talk to you in a minute about a very specific church that made a difference. But Madison is said, listen, you're going to have to come back into Virginia here, and you're going to have to urge people to vote for this Constitution. And he sat down. Baptist history tells us he sat down with a very influential preacher, John Leland, in Virginia. And Leland said, listen, we'll vote for it if you give us a Bill of Rights. You state that we have religious freedom, and we're going to be promised religious freedom. Otherwise, you don't have our support. And Madison took that in, and Madison said, I promise. And you know what? When he made a promise, they believed him. Unlike today, when we hear politicians make election year promises, we kind of say, well, it's because it's an election year. But no, they believed Madison because his life backed it up. He had spent his life genuinely advocating religious freedom. So when he says it, they believe him. They say, we'll take you at your word, Madison. It was not just an election year promise. So let me tell you about that election. Tell you the reasons for this very vital election and who his rival candidate was and what the results ended up being. The reason for this election that we're going to talk about in 1798 was because the Constitution had just been written. Now there's a brand new Congress. They created a House. They created a Senate. Every state has to elect members to the new House of Representatives, and Virginia has drawn up their congressional district lines, and there's a 5th congressional district right there that needs a candidate, someone to send to not to Washington, D.C., it was New York City at the time. Madison wants to run, and he wants to go back and continue to serve, but he wants to serve in this new House. But the governor of the state of Virginia has other plans. As much as I love Patrick Henry for some other things, Patrick Henry here did everything he could to obstruct James Madison from even making it or even being able to have a chance to be elected here for this 5th congressional district. Madison showed some interest in maybe being appointed U.S. Senator. Back then, state legislatures appointed the senators. We vote for senators today because of a constitutional amendment, but back then the state legislatures appointed the senates, and Madison, showed some interest in maybe being the senator, and Governor Henry said no, not Madison, somebody else, and he appointed someone else. So that kind of closed the door there for Madison, and then the governor and the legislature gerrymandered Madison's district. Now, gerrymandering is very simply when a state legislature, after a census, redraws the population, the district lines, so as to favor one political party over the next. Just like in Delaware here, every county is known which way they lean. And what Governor Henry and the legislature did here, they gerrymandered it so that it would favor the anti-federalist candidate. And so Madison the odds are greatly against him from ever getting elected. And in fact, some of them suggested, Madison, maybe you ought to go run in another district. And so then the governor, along with the legislature, they pushed through a residency requirement that said, no, you can't go run in another district. You have to run in the district that you live in. So once again, all these roadblocks, this political manipulation and this obstruction here to keep Madison from getting elected in a very heavily anti-federalist district. Who was his rival? Well, another Virginian, James Monroe, who was 7 years younger than him, grew up in wealth and privilege like Madison, a veteran of the American Revolution, actually had served underneath George Washington, had spent a winter at Valley Forge there. He had served in the Virginia Assembly and the Continental Congress a little bit. What's ironic is these guys are friends. They're not political enemies. And, they did something which would blow us away. They went around and campaigned together. Can you imagine? Can you imagine here in the state of Delaware? I can't imagine it in West Virginia. I can't imagine it hardly anywhere where candidates would go around together and have the same audience, and one guy gives his spiel, the other guy gets up and says, here's why you should vote for me, and they did that cordially, and they actually did that. And you know, Madison supporters wrote him and told him when he was in New York, said, if you're going to run in this election, and we've got people that support you, you're going to have to come back to Virginia and actually campaign. This is back during the day when it was too presumptuous of you to say that you want to be elected to high office. You let your supporters do that. They said, listen, you don't have a prayer of getting elected unless you're back in the district physically and you campaign and let your presence be known. So Madison does that, and he knows the odds are against him. And these two guys travel around here. But I do want to tell you, there in Culpeper County, in this district, this was considered to be Madison thought the critical county. He knew he could probably win his own home county, and they were kind of laying their odds here, but he thought the critical county was Culpeper County. And this is the church that I've told you that I've hinted at that I want to tell you about, a church, an actual local congregation that made a difference there in Culpeper County. It's the oldest Lutheran church in the United States still in use today. And at the time that Madison and Monroe show up at this church, the church is going on 50 years old at the time. It had been around a very long period of time. And both of these candidates, they go into this church, Hebron Lutheran Church, and they go in for the service and listen to special music. And then after the service, they go out in the snow, and they stand in the snow, and the members of the congregation, all bundled up, go outside in the snow and stand out in the snow for 2 hours and listen to Madison Monroe give their spiel as to why they ought to be elected to this in this critical election. And this congregation of swing voters had the power to decide which man would go to Congress. Now, there's really two ways you could take a look at this. If they voted for Monroe, who was an anti-federalist, some of the anti-federalists wanted a brand new convention. Let's start all over again. Everything at Philadelphia, throw out, let's start all over again. And he wanted a Bill of Rights. Everything would possibly be tossed aside if Monroe was elected. Could the United States, the states at that time, could they break apart? Who knows? What about Madison? If they have voted for Madison, Madison is for keeping the Constitution intact. He's now at this point saying, listen, if I go back to Congress, I'll give you a Bill of Rights. I'll use my influence to push through a Bill of Rights. And many people believe that he was the man to get it done and to help save the country. And so on the 31st of July, 2 days before the election, a huge snowstorm hit Virginia. And in fact, 10 inches of snow blanketed across the Piedmont region there of Virginia. Bitterly cold temperatures, all of the roads back during the day, the dirt roads, all frozen over, made travel very difficult. Election day rolled around on the 2nd of February, and the thermometer there in Fredericksburg was 0. And you know, people back at that time had to physically get on and travel to their local courthouse to give their vote. And I just stumbled across this past week, which I wasn't aware of. Still back at this time, there are no secret ballots. It's all voice vote. You would go into your county courthouse, you would find the sheriff or a clerk, and it could be other people around, and you walked in and you said, Madison or Monroe. And they would take and they would tally mark, and then you walked out and you were done. That's how quick it was. And you had to make a conscious effort. Certainly those that got out and voted that day had to make a conscious effort to get out and vote despite the weather. And you take a look at what happened. Madison won 4 counties out of 8. Monroe won 4 counties out of 8. One of the counties that Monroe won, he only won by 1 vote. Madison carried his home county of Orange County, which is really not much of a surprise, but John Leland and the Baptists got the vote out. And Culpeper County, where this Hebron Lutheran Church was, Madison carried that county, very critical county, by some 153 votes. And Madison ended up winning this election by 336 votes on a day with terrible weather. In fact, he's told years later by a number of supporters when he was president, said, you remember that election, 1798, that you got elected for Congress? Said there would have been no way that you would have gotten elected had it not been for the weather, because they were going to vote for Monroe. And you take a look, because I believe in a providential God. I believe a God that controls the weather. And yes, the weather affects voting patterns in the United States. Now, could God have used anyone other than Madison? Were there other people like Mason and others that stood for religious liberty and had influence? Yes. But did God want Madison to be used? Yes. And God, just like Daniel chapter 2 says that he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and he setteth up kings. God elected to use Madison. And so, true to his word, Madison went back to the House of Representatives the next year and proposed a Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution. He used his influence to get that pushed through. Now, it took 29 months for all of the states to vote upon it, to get all the 13 states. And by the way, who was the first to ratify it? It was Delaware. And, you think about these amendments, the ones we treasure the most, the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. Now it's easy to understand how much that meant to Madison and why that meant so much to Madison. We're prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Listen, this First Amendment debate, we know, still continues today. Prayers at graduations and prayers at sporting events. I recently read here that the Mississippi governor signed a bill that allows student-led prayers over the intercoms there in Mississippi at graduations and at sporting events. Now, they're all student-led. Teachers and principals aren't doing it, but they're student-led. And he's been told, well, the ACLU and other organizations, they're going to file suit against you. He said, bring it on. We'll spend state tax dollars to defend it because we believe it's a right. And we know this First Amendment issue. Some of you are aware that the owner of Hobby Lobby is a Christian man. And there's also an organization, a business called Mardell Christian Bookstores. Both of these have asked for a religious exemption from the federal health care bill because they believe that paying for certain contraceptives would be objectionable, and for religious conscience, they want to be excluded from that. Federal government has said, no, you can't be exempted. And so they're in court over this. Federal government said, well, if you don't go along, then starting January 1st of 2013, you're going to be fined $1.3 million a day. And so right now, that's on hold right now. They haven't had to pay one fine, which is good. But if in the end, like we talked about during Sunday school, if activist judges, if some come in and say, it doesn't matter whether or not you're not a church, if you're a businessman and this is your religious conviction, it's too bad. You can't exercise your First Amendment conviction, then businesses like Hobby Lobby and others are going to go bankrupt and they're going to be gone. As we go through here, we kind of look at some of these men, and I often get asked, well, do you think Madison was a Christian? Well, that's a big question mark. You take a look at the fact that he was raised in a religious atmosphere. He certainly was impacted by religious persecution in Virginia. Some of these men that had an impact on him in his early life were ministers. I told you he went to Princeton, and certainly John Witherspoon. He goes back a year and studies theology with John Witherspoon and gave some consideration to the ministry, but then felt led to go really into law later. We certainly know that he believes that the Christian religion was of a divine origin. You see this quote here, we assert for ourselves a freedom to embrace, to profess, and to observe the religion which we believe to be of divine origin. We believe what we believe to be of divine origin as well. He believed that a person needed their names written in the Lamb's Book of Life to go to heaven, which we would agree with as well. If you take a look at some of some of his Bibles, and one of his Bibles here, and some of the handwritten notes, and some of his Bibles here, I think they show evidence of a man who had a changed heart, who was a believer. He talked about believers being in a state of grace. He talked about humility, which I think he was a very humble man here. He talked about giving, and he certainly talked about grace, the free gift of God. Some of these things, you take a look at them in their whole, does it give any indication that he was a Christian? There's a strong likelihood that he could have been. But he was a prepared person with his life's experiences for a prepared time in history. A virtuous man, a sympathetic man, a humble man, a man of his word, all of these things that we want to see in our politicians today. Isn't that right? And in the candidates that run for public office. And I am of the notion that they're out there. We have to find them. If you're a young person here, a young man or young woman, and politics and history interests you, well then you can make a difference. If that's the bent and interest that you have, we need more people like you. I'm privileged to know the minority leader there in the state of West Virginia in the Republican Party, Tim Armstead, he's in the minority, he's trying to do and make an influence there in the West Virginia State Legislature. His daughter graduated from our Christian school. He's a fine Christian, and he's fighting an uphill battle. Maybe not to the degree that you've had to fight here in Delaware here, but he's trying to be salt and light, and it's encouraging to see him trying to do what's right, but we need more people like him. And it's wrong to just simply think that we've got the Constitution and we've got the Bill of Rights and we can just sit back and do nothing, and that's not true. There was one guy that signed the Constitution from Maryland, John Francis Mercer. He said it's a great mistake to suppose that the paper that we're to propose will govern the United States. He says, don't think for a second that paper alone is going to do it because we wrote it. He went on to say, he said it's the men who will bring it into government and the interest they have in maintaining it. Men are the substance. Do you get that? It's the men and women that we elect that are going to uphold the Constitution and the principles that were found in the Constitution. We need men and women of virtue. We need men and women of character. We need men and women of morals. Not the ones like we talked about in Sunday school that will just tell us what they think that we want to hear from them. We want to see their track record. Okay, you say you support this. Where's the proof? Where's your word? What's your voting record here? And James Madison, or not James Madison, but James Garfield said, now more than ever, and this is before he was president, the people are responsible for the character of their Congress. He said, if the next centennial does not find us a great nation, it will be because those who represent the culture, the morality of the nation, do not aid in the controlling the political forces. God help us to pray for candidates and for men and women that want to serve us. And I saw on the news here last week a member of Congress point at a government bureaucrat and said, I want to remind you that you work for the American people, and they do represent us. And that's the government that we have selected here, a representative democracy here. But may we pray for our nation. And like we said this morning, pray for our president, pray for our members of Congress. And certainly let's pray that God will raise up, like in years past, virtuous men and women like James Madison. God help us. Pastor Whitman.